Imagine breaking your arm, right? You go to hospital, you're looking at the x-ray, and the doctor turns to you and says that depending on where you work, your broken bone might actually present as a headache.
Which would just be entirely baffling.
Exactly. I mean, you'd think they were crazy.
Yeah.
But honestly, that is essentially how confusing public health communication around autism spectrum disorder has become for the layperson.
It really has, because, we are dealing with a medical reality that totally defies the visual, like, binary markers that society usually relies on.
Right. If you have a broken arm, it's broken. You can see it.
Yeah, in a standard pathological model, an illness is, it's an invading force or a structural break. It's localized, you can point to it.
But with neurodiversity, it doesn't work.
No, the entire paradigm collapses. It leaves behind this diagnostic landscape that requires a completely different vocabulary. And honestly, completely upends the traditional framework most people are, comfortable with.
Which is exactly why I wanted to bring this specific source material to the table for our deep dive today.
Yeah, it's a really interesting piece.
It is. So, for you listening, we are looking at a very brief, yet incredibly dense excerpt from a publication called MELIS.
Super dense.
Yeah, and it's basically an article attempting to bridge this enormous gap between how medical professionals understand autism spectrum disorder, ASD, and how the general public interprets it.
Because there's a huge disconnect there.
Massive. And the stated mission of the text is to clarify the diagnostic organization of ASD. But it does so in a way that feels almost counterintuitive at first glance.
It really does. I mean, the tension is apparent right in the title of the piece.
Right. The title is literally a question.
Exactly. ASD has types, 5 characteristic tendencies. It immediately confronts the central linguistic challenge we face today.
Because, as the text explicitly notes right off the bat, the opportunity to hear the acronym ASD has drastically increased in daily life. You hear it everywhere now.
Oh, absolutely. On the news, social media, everywhere.
Yet public comprehension remains totally fractured.
Well, because the presentation of these characteristics varies completely from individual to individual.
Right. And I was struck by that title immediately because, to me, it feels like a step backward in our understanding of neurodiversity.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, think about it. For years, the medical community has fought tooth and nail to establish the spectrum model, right?
Yeah, moving away from the old rigid category.
Exactly. And the whole point of a spectrum is to emphasize continuous, infinite fluidity, like a rainbow.
Right. It's not a series of distinct boxes.
So when I see an article asking ASD has types and promising to categorize it into 5 tendencies, my immediate reaction is to push back.
You're like, wait, didn't we just get rid of types?
Yes. Why construct types if we've already established the reality of a spectrum? I mean, doesn't that defeat the entire purpose of the clinical evolution we just went through?
I mean, that reaction makes complete sense if we look at this purely from the perspective of scientific taxonomy. The shift to a spectrum model was a necessary clinical correction. The older framework, which relied on those rigidly distinct subdiagnoses.
Like Asperger's and things like that?
Exactly. That older framework simply wasn't holding up to reality. The lines were too blurry.
But then why go back?
Well, the complication there is that while infinite fluidity is scientifically accurate, it is cognitively paralyzing for the average person.
Okay, wait. What do you mean by cognitively paralyzing?
I mean, if you're trying to navigate everyday interactions, human brains don't do well with infinite variables.
Ah, I see. It's too abstract.
Way too abstract.
So if you are like an educator trying to support a student or a manager trying to accommodate an employee, you can't just operationalize infinite fluidity.
Precisely the issue. You need a starting point. And the Mellows article is recognizing a fundamental limitation in human psychology.
Which is?
We process the world through heuristics. We need pattern recognition to establish empathy and structure support.
Right. We need to be able to recognize something to understand how to deal with it.
Exactly. The text notes that characteristics appear completely differently depending on the person. So, by introducing the concept of types, or more accurately, tendencies, the medical communicators are essentially providing a cognitive handhold.
A cognitive handhold. I like that phrase.
Yeah, they aren't abandoning the spectrum at all. They are translating an overwhelming clinical reality into a functional framework for the public.
So it's basically a concession to how our brains actually process complex information.
Yes, exactly. They are drawing a map.
And a map isn't the territory.
Right. It might not capture every single grain of sand on the territory, but it allows the public to at least navigate the landscape without getting hopelessly lost.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So we're creating functional boxes, not clinical boxes.
Exactly. And if we view this article as a map, we really have to look closely at the cartographer.
Oh, the supervising doctor,
Right.
yes.
Because the specific framework this text uses to categorize ASD is not your standard generic clinical approach.
Not at all.
It is heavily influenced by the supervising physician, and his background fundamentally alters the lens through which these tendencies are viewed.
This is where I found myself legitimately confused while reviewing the source. Like, okay, the article is supervised by Dr. Yoshiro Iijima.
The director of the Izumo Iijima Clinic.
Right. And when I read a piece defining the Diagnostic Organization of Neurodiversity for the public, I expect, a clinical psychiatrist.
Sure, or maybe a cognitive neuroscientist.
Exactly. But the text explicitly highlights 3 very specific, non-traditional focus areas for Dr. Iijima.
Yeah, it lists school refusal, Campo for children and adults, and psychosomatic medicine.
Right. So I'm sitting there wondering, why is someone with a background in herbal medicine and truancy writing a definitive guide on ASD types for a mainstream platform?
It seems like a mismatch at first glance, doesn't it?
Completely. I mean, what does school refusal have to do with the foundational understanding of the autism spectrum?
Well, to understand that, we really have to deeply analyze the intersection of those 3 disciplines.
Okay, let's break them down.
Let's start with school refusal.
Hmm?
This is often referred to as futoko in Japan.
Right. And over here, we'd probably just call it truancy.
We would, but that word carries a lot of behavioral baggage.
Yeah.
In a clinical setting, an adolescent refusing to attend school is rarely viewed merely as a behavioral rebellion.
It's not just a kid skipping class to go to the mall.
Exactly. It is almost always an acute symptom of a systemic friction between the individual and their environment.
Friction, meaning the kid and the school are just grinding against each other.
Right, because for someone who is neurodivergent, a standard classroom isn't just boring. It can be actively hostile.
Oh, absolutely. You have the auditory assault of a crowded room.
The fluorescent lights humming.
Yeah, and the intense cognitive load of decoding all those unwritten social hierarchies.
Not to mention the sheer exhaustion of constantly masking natural behaviors just to blend in.
So when you look at school refusal through that lens, it completely stops being a separate, behavioral issue.
It becomes a practical manifestation of an unrecognized ASD profile.
Wow. Okay, so by specializing in school refusal, Dr. Iijima is basically stationed at the absolute collision point between a neurodivergent mind and an inflexible societal structure.
Exactly. He isn't dealing with autism as an abstract checklist on a DSM-5 clipboard.
He's not just checking boxes in a quiet, sterile office.
No, he is dealing with the structural fallout. He is witnessing firsthand what happens when the environment demands a level of adaptation the individual simply cannot sustain.
So his primary interaction with the spectrum is through the lens of environmental friction, not just isolated brain chemistry.
Right, and that drastically reframes how he would approach categorizing the disorder.
Because he wouldn't be dividing people by invisible neurological markers.
Exactly. He would likely divide them by how that friction presents in reality, how it looks when the person hits the wall of societal expectations.
Which leads directly into the significance of the other 2 specialties mentioned in the text.
Campo and psychosomatic medicine.
Right, because the inclusion of these disciplines implies a medical philosophy that sharply contrasts with the traditional Western pathological model.
Oh, a total contrast. Because the traditional Western model typically seeks to isolate a specific disease entity
Yeah.
and eradicate or suppress it.
Like finding a bacteria and prescribing an antibiotic.
Exactly. But Campo is traditional Japanese medicine.
Right, which relies heavily on a systems-based approach.
Yeah, it's less about attacking a localized pathogen and much more about restoring balance to the entire organism.
Looking at the whole picture.
Correct. In a Campo framework, illness is often viewed as a dysregulation of the body's natural systems.
And then you combine that holistic perspective with his third specialty, psychosomatic medicine.
The study of the mind-body connection.
Right. So when you put those together, you get a deeply integrated view of human suffering.
You really do. Consider the child experiencing the severe environmental friction we just discussed with school refusal.
Okay.
In a purely pathological model, they might be diagnosed with, say, generalized anxiety.
And then they're just prescribed a targeted medication to suppress that specific emotional response.
Right. But with a psychosomatic approach, You recognize that the emotional distress doesn't just stay in the brain.
It leaks out.
Exactly. The intense stress of sensory overload or social masking triggers a massive physiological cascade.
Right, the amygdala fires, cortisol just floods the system.
The enteric nervous system reacts, and suddenly that child has chronic migraines or severe gastrointestinal pain.
The mental friction literally becomes a physical reality.
Yes. So if you take that a step further, think about what it means for a doctor with this specific triad of specialties to supervise an article explaining ASD to the general public.
Right, he isn't going to frame autism as a collection of psychiatric flaws that need to be cured.
He can't. His entire medical background dictates an approach that views the individual as a complex, interconnected system operating within a specific environment.
That changes the entire objective of the article.
It really does.
This is not about giving the reader a checklist to, pathologize their peers.
No, it's about outlining how different systemic profiles react to the world around them.
And that philosophical foundation absolutely dictates the specific semantic choices used in the text.
Oh, the word choices are incredibly deliberate.
Yeah, because the source doesn't just casually throw out the word types and leave it at that. It meticulously reframes the conversation.
Right. It promises to explain ASD through the view for understanding it by the tendency of characteristics.
Yes, and it specifically sets out to outline 5 representative tendencies.
That word tendency is key.
I really want to dig into that specific word because tendency does an enormous amount of heavy lifting in this text.
It completely changes the linguistic environment.
It really does. It reminds me of the difference between a rigid diagnostic label and like a meteorological forecast.
Oh, weather forecast. How so?
Well, think about it. If a doctor gives you a label, it implies a permanent static condition, like this is a rock.
Right, a rock is always a rock.
Exactly. But if they describe a tendency, it implies a likelihood or a direction. It's like saying a particular climate has a tendency for high humidity.
Ah, I see. Which means it's not humid 100% of the time.
Exactly. It fluctuates.
That shift from deterministic language to probabilistic language is one of the most vital strategies in modern public health communication.
Because a label can often feel like a permanent box.
It implies uniformity. But the text itself already established that characteristics vary widely depending on the individual.
So if you assign a rigid label, you contradict the reality of the spectrum.
You do. But a tendency allows for movement.
It acknowledges that behavior and presentation aren't just, baked into the DNA, totally immune to outside influence.
Right. If the behavior is a tendency, it means it can fluctuate based on the environment.
Yes. If we connect this back to Dr. Iijima's background in school refusal and psychosomatic medicine, the concept of a tendency perfectly aligns with an environmental approach.
It maps on perfectly. Think about a child who might have a strong tendency towards sensory overwhelm. In a chaotic, loud classroom, that tendency manifests as a severe psychosomatic shutdown, migraines, stomach aches, school refusal.
Right. But if you alter the environment,
If you provide noise-canceling headphones or a quiet space.
the manifestation of that tendency changes entirely.
Exactly. The underlying neurotype is the same, but the tendency doesn't flare into a crisis because the environment adapted.
And that completely shifts the burden.
How do you mean?
Well, when we use labels, the burden of adaptation is almost always placed squarely on the neurodivergent individual.
Oh, absolutely. They are the ones who are disordered.
Right. Therefore, they are the ones who must change or be medicated to fit the environment.
But when we use the framework of tendencies,
It implies an interaction. The environment is suddenly part of the equation.
that fosters a completely different kind of empathy.
It really does. Because if you're listening to this or reading the Melos article and you adopt this framework of characteristic tendencies, you are no longer looking for diseases to cure in your colleagues or your children.
You are looking for patterns to accommodate.
Exactly. It fundamentally alters the societal approach from one of assimilation to one of structural support.
Which is why the architecture of the article itself is the real breakthrough here.
Right. Even though our source excerpt stops right before detailing what those 5 specific tendencies actually are.
Which is a shame. I'd love to read them.
I know, me too. But the mere act of creating this specific linguistic bridge is a masterclass in medical communication.
It really is. They took the infinite, often paralyzing complexity of the diagnostic spectrum,
Filtered it through a deeply holistic mind-body medical philosophy.
and distilled it into an actionable, empathetic framework for the layperson.
It's brilliant. But that actually brings us to a crucial structural component of the source material that we really need to talk about.
The formatting.
Yes, we have this profound, nuanced translation of medical philosophy, but we have to examine exactly where and how this translation is being delivered to the public.
Because the medium through which this information travels is just as significant as the information itself.
Honestly, this is perhaps the most fascinating aspect of the text we reviewed.
It is so jarring.
It really is. If you look at the raw formatting of the source, there is an intense juxtaposition.
A total whiplash.
Right. Because we just spent all this time unpacking the deep implications of psychosomatic medicine and the linguistic brilliance of probabilistic medical phrasing.
And then, immediately following the introduction of this holistic framework, the text slams right into standard digital boilerplate.
Literally right underneath it.
It just lists all the legal and operational metadata necessary for digital distribution.
Right, it reads, indication based on the Act on Specified Commercial Transactions.
Matters stipulated in the Telecommunications Business Act.
Operating company, help center, for media operators.
Developer blog.
Terms of service, privacy policy.
Smart News JP edition.
Copyright 2012-2026 Smart News, Inc. I mean, it is such a jarring transition. We are placing these life-altering medical frameworks right alongside links to a developer blog.
It's wild. But it highlights a broader shift in how scientific knowledge integrates into the cultural consciousness today.
How so?
Well, historically, this level of nuanced diagnostic discussion was gated.
Right, it was locked away.
It was confined to psychiatric journals, specialized medical conferences, or, behind the closed doors of a clinician's office.
The general public simply did not have access to the debate over taxonomy versus spectrum.
Exactly. But now, it's being pushed through aggregators like Smart News.
Right. It's sitting right there on a home screen, sandwiched between sports updates and algorithmic advertisements.
In terms of service agreements.
Which makes me wonder, honestly, if packaging something as complex as neurodiversity into a fast food digital feed cheapens the science.
That's a fair question.
Like, do we lose the gravity of the medical reality when it's formatted for a quick scroll on a morning commute?
That is a very valid concern. But I think the text itself actually provides the counterargument right in its opening line.
Oh, the line about the frequency of the word.
Exactly. Opportunities to hear the word ASD have increased.
Right.
The democratization of this information, regardless of how clumsily it might be formatted alongside legal disclaimers, is the actual engine of societal change.
Because keeping the nuanced truth locked in an academic journal doesn't actually help the child experiencing school refusal.
Precisely. The digital packaging isn't a corruption of the science. It is a necessary adaptation to the modern attention economy.
A necessary adaptation.
Think about it. If the goal is to shift public perception, to move society away from rigid pathologizing labels and toward an empathetic understanding of characteristic tendencies, you cannot wait for the public to seek out academic literature.
Because they won't. People are busy.
Right. You have to penetrate the cultural membrane. You have to deliver the paradigm shift directly to their news feeds.
It's a pragmatic approach to public health.
Very pragmatic.
The medical communicators realize that the modern reader has a profound tendency for distraction. We are completely overwhelmed by data.
So they adapt their communication strategy to fit the environment of the reader.
Wow, which is exactly what they advocate for doing for the neurodivergent individual.
Exactly. It parallels the philosophy perfectly. They distill the complexity into 5 representative tendencies, they package it cleanly, and they distribute it through mass market platforms.
So the juxtaposition of Dr. Iijima's holistic medical philosophy with the Smart News copyright footer isn't an anomaly at all.
No, it is the blueprint for modern medical advocacy.
It is the exact mechanism required to bridge the gap we discussed at the very beginning of our analysis.
Yes, it takes the invisible, murky reality of the diagnostic landscape and makes it visible, accessible, and actionable for the masses.
It meets you right where you are, on your phone.
Exactly.
So as we look back over this deep dive into the underlying architecture of this text, we see a really fascinating progression.
We really do.
We started with the inherent contradiction of trying to find neat types within an infinite spectrum.
And we explored how the specific lens of the supervising physician, a doctor stationed at the intersection of environmental friction, holistic campo medicine, and psychosomatic reality, prevents those types from becoming rigid, pathologizing boxes.
Right, because that holistic foundation birthed the linguistic shift from clinical labels to fluid tendencies.
Creating a framework that demands environmental accommodation rather than individual assimilation.
And finally, we saw how this entire philosophical shift is being deployed directly to the public through the blunt democratizing force of digital news aggregators.
Which is so crucial. Ultimately, the utility of this text lies in its ability to foster a more adaptable mindset for anyone reading it.
Because whether you, as a listener, are dealing with complex team dynamics in a corporate setting or just trying to understand a family member better, adopting this lens changes everything.
It really goes. Looking at characteristic tendencies rather than strict, binary pathology changes the entire nature of the interaction.
It moves the conversation from what is wrong with you to how is this environment interacting with your natural baseline?
Which is a profound shift in empathy.
It is. It provides the cognitive handholds we desperately need without sacrificing the humanity of the individual.
Exactly.
But as we wrap up today's deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to consider. We've spent a lot of time discussing how brilliant it is that these medical experts broke down the infinite complexity of the autistic spectrum into 5 manageable representative tendencies so the public could digest it.
Right, making it accessible.
But it begs a larger philosophical question. Are these 5 categories revealing something fundamental and empirically true about how the neurodivergent brain is organized?
Or do they reveal something else?
Exactly. Or do these categories reveal absolutely nothing about autism and everything about us?
That's a heavy thought.
I mean, are we looking at a genuine map of human neurochemistry, or are we just looking at a mirror reflecting society's unyielding, desperate need to force everything, even the beautiful, infinite fluidity of the human mind, into a structure we already know how to comprehend?
We do love our boxes.
We really do. It's something to consider the next time you find yourself, or someone else, trying to place a complex human behavior into a neat, easily defined box.
Very true.
Keep questioning the frameworks, look closely at the tendencies, and thank you for joining us on this deep dive.